The notice arrived on a Tuesday. It wasn't delivered with a knock. It was just there, nailed to her cabin door, a white paper ghost against the weathered wood. Clara McGraw stared at it, her breath catching in the cold morning air. She didn't need to read the words. She knew what they said. She'd felt them coming for months, a storm gathering on the horizon of her life. Foreclosure. 60 days. 60 days until the bank took the only home her children had ever known. 60 days until they were cast out, with winter's bitter teeth already starting to bite. "Mama?" Emma's voice was small, but it cut through Clara's paralysis. At 8 years old, her daughter had learned to read her mother's face like a book, and right now, that book was filled with terror. Clara forced a smile that felt like broken glass. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just an old paper." She ripped the notice from the door, the nails screeching in protest. She crumpled it in her fist, hiding the cruel black letters from her daughter's eyes. But she couldn't hide the truth from herself. She owed the bank $347. It might as well have been $1 million. Her husband, Tom, had been gone for 2 years, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley like a thief in the night. He'd left her with 160 acres of hard land, 2 beautiful children, and a heart full of memories. But memories couldn't buy firewood. Memories couldn't fill empty bellies. She'd fought. Lord, how she'd fought. She'd sold their few cattle one by one. She'd planted a garden that fed them through the summer, but yielded little to sell. She'd patched their clothes until the patches had patches. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. And now, time was up. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat at her small kitchen table, the crumpled notice spread out before her. The numbers mocked her. The deadline loomed. Panic was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her heart. She could go back east, maybe, live with Tom's sister. But the train fare was a fortune she didn't have. And leaving this land, it felt like burying Tom all over again. There was only one option. One last, desperate chance. She would have to go into town. She would have to swallow the last of her pride and beg Mr. Murphy at the general store for credit. A line of credit to see them through the winter. Maybe she could work it off, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, anything. It was a sliver of hope. But it was all she had. She saddled their old mare, the moon casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. The wind whispered through the pines, sounding like a warning. As she rode the 3 miles to Copper Rock, she rehearsed her speech, trying to find the right words, the right balance of dignity and desperation. She had no idea that her ride into town was not just a journey of miles, but a journey into a web of secrets that had been spun long before she'd ever set foot in this valley. She thought she was riding to beg for credit. She was wrong. She was riding straight into the arms of a bigger, more dangerous bargain than she could ever imagine. And the man who was about to offer it was watching her from the shadows right now. The lights of Copper Rock flickered in the distance, a small constellation of hope in a sea of darkness. The town was little more than a single dusty street, anchored by Murphy's General Store on one end and the Silver Dollar Saloon on the other. Clara tied her mare to the hitching post in front of the store, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She took a deep breath, ready to face her humiliation. That's when he stepped out of the alley beside the store, Elias Boone. He was a mountain of a man, so tall and broad that he seemed to block out the moonlight. Every woman in the territory knew of Elias Boone. He owned the Lazy Bee Ranch, a sprawling empire of 12,000 acres and thousands of cattle. He was impossibly wealthy, impossibly handsome, and impossibly alone. People said he was haunted, that the deaths of his parents and his sister years ago had hollowed him out, leaving nothing but silence and sorrow behind. He was a man to be admired from a distance, like a storm cloud or a grizzly bear. Not a man to be approached. But he was approaching her now. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he were trying not to spook a wild animal. "Mrs. McGraw." His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It was the first time he'd ever spoken to her directly. Clara's hand tightened on the saddle horn. "Mr. Boone." He stopped a respectful distance away, his face half hidden in the shadow of his hat. She could feel the intensity of his gaze, and it made the hair on her arms stand up. "I heard about your troubles," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that felt heavy in the night air. Clara's cheeks burned with shame. Of course he'd heard. In Copper Rock, secrets traveled faster than the wind. "My affairs are my own, Mr. Boone." "I'm not here to pry," he said. "I'm here to make you an offer." An offer? What could a man like Elias Boone possibly offer a woman like her? A job, perhaps? Mending his clothes? Cleaning his massive empty house? She waited. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. "I know this is going to sound unconventional," he began, and she could see his large hands twisting the brim of his hat. The gesture of nervousness was so at odds with his powerful frame that it caught her off guard. "My ranch," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "It needs a woman's touch." He paused, and his next words hit her with the force of a physical blow. "And your children need a father." Clara stared at him, her mind refusing to process what she was hearing. The air crackled between them. The sounds of the saloon down the street faded into a dull roar. I beg your pardon?" she stammered. "I'm proposing marriage, Mrs. McGraw." He said it simply, a statement of fact, but the world tilted on its axis. Marriage? To him? A man she'd never spoken to before this moment? It was madness. It was insulting. "Mr. Boone, you can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and indignation. "I've never been more serious in my life." He took a step closer, and for the first time, she saw his eyes clearly in the moonlight. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths, she saw a loneliness that mirrored her own. "This wouldn't be a marriage of love," he said quickly, as if sensing her panic. "I know your heart belongs to your late husband. This would be a practical arrangement, a partnership." A partnership. The word hung in the air. "I have a house with 8 empty rooms," he went on, his voice gaining strength. "Land and cattle enough to ensure we'd never want for anything. I can give your children stability, a future. All I ask in return is for you to make my house a home, to fill the silence." Clara's mind was reeling. She thought of the foreclosure notice, of Emma's worried face, of 5-year-old Samuel, who barely remembered his own father. This man was offering her a lifeline, a way out of an impossible situation. But the cost, it was unthinkable. "Why?" she whispered, the question torn from her. "Why me?" Elias looked away, towards the dark prairie that stretched out behind her. "Because I've seen you. I've watched you for 2 years. I've seen your strength, your courage. I've seen how you love your children. You're the kind of woman who builds things, Mrs. McGraw. And my life, it's been empty for too long." He looked back at her, his gaze direct and piercing. "I will pay off your debt at the bank tomorrow morning. You and the children can move to the ranch immediately. You will want for nothing. I will expect nothing from you in return that you are not willing to give. We would have separate rooms. Your children would be my own to raise and protect. Their father's memory will always be honored." He had thought of everything, every objection, every fear. It was as if he had been planning this for months. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. "I need time to think," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course." He stepped back, giving her space. "But don't take too long. Winter doesn't wait." She climbed back onto her mare, her body moving on instinct. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. As she rode away from Copper Rock, she didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen Elias Boone still standing in the street, a solitary figure watching her disappear into the darkness. And she might have wondered if he was a savior, or something else entirely. The wedding was a quiet, hurried affair. Just 3 days after his shocking proposal, Clara stood beside Elias Boone in Reverend Hamilton's study. The only witnesses were the Reverend's wife and a clerk from the general store. Clara wore her best Sunday dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days. Elias stood beside her, silent and immense in a dark suit that made the small room feel even smaller. "Do you, Elias Boone, take this woman?" His voice was a low, steady rumble when he said, "I do." He slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. It felt heavy, a manacle of gold. "And do you, Clara McGraw, take this man?" Clara looked at her children. Emma stood stiffly, her small face a mask of suspicion. Samuel, too young to understand, just looked confused. She thought of the foreclosure notice, now a paid receipt in Elias's pocket. She thought of the coming winter. She took a breath that felt like swallowing dust. "I do." The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. Elias leaned down and brushed a kiss against her cheek. It was so light, so respectful, it felt like the touch of a ghost. The ride to the Lazy Bee Ranch was a journey to another world. Her small, struggling homestead was a memory. This was her new life. The ranch house was a giant, rising from the prairie like a fortress. It had 2 stories, a wide wraparound porch, and enough windows to watch the whole world go by. It was a palace of wood and stone, built to last for generations, and it felt as cold and empty as a tomb. "Welcome home," Elias said, his voice echoing in the grand entryway. Home. The word felt like a lie. He showed them to their rooms upstairs. The children got 2 adjoining rooms at the end of the hall, sunny and bright. Her room was across the hall from his, a vast, lonely space with a 4-poster bed and a window that looked out over the endless land. "I'll let you get settled," he said, and then he was gone, his boots echoing down the long hallway. Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She had done it. She had saved her children. She had sold herself. The first few days were a strange dance of polite avoidance. Clara explored the house, a ghost in her own home. It was a place frozen in time. She could see the faint outlines on the walls where pictures once hung. She found a dusty piano bench in the parlor, but the piano was gone. In the kitchen, built-in shelves stood empty, waiting for cookbooks and jars of preserves that were never coming. This house hadn't just been emptied of people. It had been emptied of life. Elias was a phantom. He was gone before sunrise and returned after dark, eating the meals she left for him in silence before disappearing into his study. He was honoring his part of the bargain, keeping his distance. But his presence was everywhere, in the sheer size of the furniture, in the scent of leather and horses that clung to the air, in the way the floorboards creaked under his weight in the room across the hall. Samuel, with the boundless optimism of a 5-year-old, was fascinated by his new stepfather. He would trail Elias to the barns, peppering him with questions. "Can I ride a horse, Elias? Can I?" "When you're a little older, son." Elias was surprisingly gentle with the boy, his deep voice softening when he spoke to him. But he kept his distance from Emma, as if sensing the girl's fierce, protective loyalty to her mother. Emma was Clara's shadow, her eyes constantly darting towards Elias, full of mistrust. "Why is he so quiet, Mama?" she'd whisper at night. "Does he not like us?" "He's just a quiet man, sweetheart," Clara would say, though she was asking herself the same questions. One afternoon, while exploring the upstairs hallway, Clara noticed something she hadn't seen before. At the far end, past a linen closet, was another door. Unlike the others, this one was made of heavy, dark wood, and it had a large iron lock. It was the only locked door in the entire house. Curiosity gnawed at her. She tried the handle. It was solid, unmoving. She peered through the keyhole, but it was dark. What was he hiding in there? What secrets did this silent, lonely house hold? That evening at dinner, she decided to ask. "Elias," she began, her voice sounding small in the vast dining room. "There's a locked room at the end of the upstairs hall." Elias froze, a forkful of potatoes halfway to his mouth. He set the fork down carefully. His face, which had been placid and unreadable, became a mask of stone. "That room is not your concern," he said, his voice flat and cold. It was the first time he had ever used that tone with her. "I was just curious. Some things are best left alone, Clara." He didn't say another word for the rest of the meal. The silence was no longer polite. It was heavy, charged, and full of warning. Later that night, as she lay in her bed, listening to the wind howl outside, she couldn't stop thinking about that door. Elias had offered her a safe harbor, a place to raise her children. But she was beginning to realize that the house had secrets, and the man she had married had even more. The locked door became an obsession. Clara would find herself standing before it, her hand hovering over the cold iron lock. What was in there? Old memories he couldn't bear to face? Something belonging to his late parents? Or something else? Something darker? The house itself began to feel different. Less like a sad, empty place and more like a place with a secret to keep. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper. The creak of the floorboards at night sounded like footsteps. Elias remained a polite, distant stranger, but there were cracks in his armor. One morning, Clara came downstairs to find him in the kitchen, carving a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife. His large, powerful hands moved with surprising delicacy. He looked up, startled, as she entered, and quickly tried to hide what he was doing, but not before she saw it. It was a horse, a small, perfectly carved wooden horse, complete with a flowing mane and a tiny, detailed saddle. "It's for Samuel," he mumbled, his cheeks turning a dusky red. "A boy on a ranch ought to have a horse." He gave it to Samuel at breakfast. The boy's face lit up with a joy so pure it brought tears to Clara's eyes. He clutched the toy to his chest as if it were treasure. From that day on, Samuel was Elias's shadow, and slowly, painstakingly, the ice around Elias began to melt. He started teaching Samuel how to care for the horses. He'd let the boy help him mend fences. Clara would watch from the kitchen window, a strange ache in her chest, as the giant of a man and the small boy forged a bond. Even Emma, her fiercely loyal Emma, started to thaw. Elias found her one afternoon trying to read one of the heavy books of poetry from the parlor shelf, a volume that had clearly belonged to his mother. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. Instead of ignoring her, Elias sat down. "That was my mother's favorite," he said, his voice soft. "She used to read it to me." And then, to Clara's astonishment, he began to read aloud. His deep voice filled the parlor, giving life to the lyrical words. Emma sat mesmerized, her suspicion momentarily forgotten. These moments of warmth made the mystery of his coldness even more confusing. How could a man who carved toys for a child and read poetry to another be the same man who shut down completely at the mention of a locked room? The town, meanwhile, was buzzing with gossip. When Elias took them to church the first Sunday, the whispers were like a swarm of bees. Clara could feel the eyes on her back, the assessing glances, the pity mixed with envy. Herbert Hendricks, a portly man who owned the feed store and considered himself the town's moral authority, made a point of approaching Elias after the service. "Boone," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Quite the surprise you getting hitched so sudden, especially to a widow with baggage." He gestured towards Clara and the children. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Emma shrank behind her skirts. Elias's transformation was terrifying. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move a muscle. But a cold fury radiated from him. He seemed to grow even larger, his shadow falling over Hendricks like a thundercloud. "Hendricks," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is my wife, Clara Boone. These are my children, Emma and Samuel Boone. If I ever hear you refer to my family as baggage again, your next conversation will be with Dr. Morrison about how to reset a broken jaw." Hendricks turned pale and sputtered an apology, practically stumbling over his own feet to get away. The crowd in the churchyard fell silent. Elias put a large, warm hand on Clara's back. "Let's go home," he said. In the wagon on the way back to the ranch, the silence was different. It wasn't awkward or tense, it was protective. He had called her his wife, Clara Boone. He had called Emma and Samuel his children. He had defended them, fiercely. It stirred something in her, something she had thought was long dead. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard him. His footsteps paused outside the locked room. She heard the faint click of the lock, the creak of the heavy door opening. He was inside for nearly an hour. When he came out, she heard something else, a sound she couldn't place at first. It was the sound of a grown man, trying very, very hard not to weep. The mystery of Elias Boone was deepening. He was a man of kindness and fury, of gentleness and secret sorrows, and Clara was beginning to fear that by marrying him to escape her past, she had stumbled into a future far more complicated and far more dangerous than she had ever bargained for. The confrontation with Hendricks in the churchyard changed something. The town's gossip didn't stop, but it changed its tune. Elias Boone, the lonely giant, was now a family man, a protector. The story of him threatening Hendricks became a local legend overnight, and in the house, the atmosphere shifted. Elias began to linger after dinner, talking quietly with Clara about the ranch, the cattle, the weather. He asked about her day. He listened, truly listened, when she spoke of the children. He was still a man of few words, but the words he chose started to carry a new weight. One evening, he found her in the parlor, staring at the empty space where the piano had once stood. "My sister Margaret used to play," he said from the doorway. His voice was thick with a memory he rarely touched. The house was always filled with music then. "What happened to the piano?" Clara asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment. After she passed, my father couldn't bear the silence where the music used to be. He sold it." He looked at the empty space. "I think it was the saddest day of his life, even sadder than the funeral. It was the most he had ever shared about his past, a small, precious key to the locked rooms of his heart." Clara felt a wave of sympathy for this man, so strong on the outside, so clearly wounded within. She started to make the house her own. She aired out the dusty linens. She polished the old wood until it gleamed. She found a stash of his mother's cookbooks and began to fill the kitchen with the smells of baking bread and simmering stews. Slowly, like a flower turning to the sun, the house began to feel like a home, and Clara began to feel like a wife. The change in her own heart was the most confusing thing of all. She had married this man for security, for her children. She had told herself she would always be Tom's widow, that her heart was buried with him. But her heart wasn't cooperating. It beat a little faster when Elias walked into a room. She found herself watching his hands as he worked, marveling at their strength and gentleness. She started to look forward to their quiet evenings, to the low rumble of his voice. She was falling in love with her husband. The realization was terrifying. It felt like a betrayal of Tom. It felt like a risk she couldn't afford to take. Then came the day of the storm. The sky turned a bruised purple in the middle of the afternoon. The wind began to howl, and a hard, driving rain lashed against the windows. Elias was out on the range, checking on a distant herd. Clara gathered the children in the parlor, trying to distract them with a story as the storm raged. Suddenly, a massive clap of thunder shook the house to its foundations. Samuel screamed and buried his face in Clara's lap. Emma, though trying to be brave, was pale and trembling. Just then, the front door burst open. Elias stood there, soaked to the skin, his face grim. "The creek's rising fast," he said. "A few of the new calves are trapped on the wrong side. I have to go back." "In this storm? Elias, you can't!" Clara cried, her heart seizing with fear. "I have to. It's my responsibility." He looked at her, his storm-gray eyes holding hers, and in that moment, she saw not just a rancher worried about his livestock, but a man driven by a profound sense of duty. He turned to go, but Clara ran to him. "Please," she whispered, her hand on his wet sleeve. "Be careful." He looked down at her hand, and then back at her face. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The storm, the children, the house, it all faded away. There was only the two of them. He reached up and cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing a gentle line along her jaw. "I will," he said softly. "I have too much to come home to now." And then he was gone, back into the fury of the storm. Clara spent the next 2 hours in a state of agony, pacing the floor, watching the windows for any sign of him. The fear she felt was primal. It was the same cold terror she'd felt when Tom's fever had broken for the last time. She was losing another husband. The thought was unbearable. When she finally saw him riding through the rain, leading a handful of shivering calves, relief washed over her so powerfully, her knees went weak. She met him at the door with a warm blanket and a hot cup of coffee. He was exhausted, muddy, but safe. That night, after the children were asleep and the storm had quieted to a gentle patter on the roof, Clara couldn't settle. The fear she had felt, the depth of it, had shown her the truth. She knocked on his bedroom door. He opened it, surprise on his face. He was in his shirt sleeves, his hair still damp from the rain. "Clara, is everything all right?" "No," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It isn't." She stepped past him into his room. It was sparse, masculine. A bed, a dresser, a single chair. On his nightstand was a framed photograph. She moved closer. It was a picture of a smiling young woman with dark hair and eyes just like his sister Margaret. "When you were out in that storm," Clara said, her back to him, "I was terrified, not just for the children. For me, I was terrified of losing you." She heard him take a breath behind her. She turned to face him. The space between them felt charged, electric. "We made a bargain, Elias," she said. "A practical arrangement. But it's not practical anymore. Not for me." He didn't move. He just watched her, his eyes searching her face. "I'm falling in love with you," she whispered, the confession hanging in the air like a prayer. "And it scares me to death." Elias closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't speak. He simply framed her face with his large, warm hands and looked at her as if he were seeing the sunrise for the first time. "Clara," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "It stopped being practical for me the day I saw you standing in front of Murphy's store, looking like you were carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I think I started falling in love with you right then." He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't like the chaste peck at their wedding. This was a kiss of longing, of relief, of 1,000 unspoken things finally being said. It was a kiss that sealed a new bargain, one not of convenience, but of the heart. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what secrets you keep in this house, Elias Boone," she murmured against his lips. "I don't know what sorrows you lock behind that door down the hall, but I'm not afraid of them anymore." A shadow passed over his eyes, a flicker of the old pain. "Some doors are best left locked, Clara." "No," she said, her voice firm with a new certainty. "Not anymore. Whatever is in there, we face it together." His embrace tightened, a silent agreement. But as Clara fell asleep in her husband's arms for the first time, a small, cold knot of fear remained in her stomach. She had unlocked his heart, but the secret behind the iron-locked door was still waiting. And she had a terrible feeling it was far darker than just a painful memory. The peace that followed their first kiss was like a dream, the house filled with laughter. Elias was no longer a silent, brooding presence, but a husband and a father. He taught Emma to ride. He took Samuel fishing. He and Clara would sit on the porch in the evenings, their hands intertwined, watching the sun set over their empire. It was perfect. Too perfect. The first crack in their idyllic world appeared in the form of a letter. It arrived from St. Louis, addressed to Clara. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside, the letter was brief and cryptic. "Dear Mrs. McGraw, I am an old acquaintance of your late husband, Thomas. I have recently learned of your new circumstances. There are matters regarding Thomas's estate, specifically the land he claimed, that you need to be aware of. Things are not as they seem. Do not trust the easy solution. I will be in Copper Rock within the month. A friend, no signature, just the chilling words. Clara's blood ran cold. Do not trust the easy solution. That could only mean one person, Elias. She wanted to dismiss it. A cruel prank, perhaps. But the mention of Tom's land, the specificity of it, felt real. She decided to show the letter to Elias. Trust had to be the foundation of this new love they were building. She found him in the barn, repairing a saddle. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it, his face growing hard. He read it a second time. The gentle husband of the past few weeks vanished, replaced by the cold, guarded man she had first married. "Who is this from?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know. It's not signed." He crumpled the letter in his massive fist. "It's nothing. Someone trying to make trouble. Forget you ever saw it." "Elias, it mentions Tom's land. It says not to trust you." Her voice trembled. "What aren't you telling me?" "I'm telling you to drop it, Clara," he snapped, his voice echoing in the barn. He had never spoken to her like that before. "It's a lie, meant to poison you against me. Can't you see that?" Fear and doubt, the old enemies, crept back into her heart. "Then why are you so angry? If it's a lie, why does it bother you so much?" He turned away from her, his broad back a wall of stone. "Because there are vultures in this world who feed on other people's happiness. This is my family, my land, and I will protect what is mine." He wouldn't look at her. He wouldn't answer her question. The warmth of the past weeks turned to ice. The dream was over. That night, she lay alone in her own bed, the space beside her cold and empty. Elias had retreated back into his shell, into his silence, and the locked door at the end of the hall seemed to mock her. A few days later, a man came to town. He was a stranger, dressed in a fine suit that was out of place in dusty Copper Rock. He checked into the only hotel. He told people he was a geologist, surveying for the railroad, but he didn't act like a geologist. He spent his time in the Silver Dollar Saloon, buying drinks, asking questions about Tom McGraw, about his land, about his widow, and questions about Elias Boone. Murphy, the store owner, rode out to the ranch to warn Elias. "This fella, Blackwood's his name. He's asking a lot of questions, Elias. Seems mighty interested in that old McGraw homestead." Clara was in the kitchen when Murphy arrived. She heard the name, Blackwood, and a jolt went through her. Could this be the man who wrote the letter? Elias's face was a thundercloud. He thanked Murphy for the warning and saw him off. Then he came into the kitchen. "Clara," he said, his voice strained, "I want you and the children to stay on the ranch. Don't go into town for any reason. Do you understand?" "Why? Because of this man, Blackwood?" "Just do as I say, please." It wasn't a request. It was an order. The fear in his eyes was real, and it terrified her. The next morning, Blackwood came to them. He rode up to the house on a fine black stallion, looking like a lord visiting his subjects. Clara saw him coming, and her heart hammered against her ribs. Elias met him on the porch. The two men faced each other like gunfighters, the air thick with tension. "Boone," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oiled silk, "I'm Harrison Blackwood. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "You're mistaken," Elias rumbled. "Everything on this ranch is mine." Blackwood smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "I'm not talking about your ranch. I'm talking about your wife." Clara gasped, stepping out from behind the door. Blackwood's eyes landed on her, and his smile widened. "Ah, the lovely widow. Clara, my dear, your late husband and I were partners. That little homestead of yours, it sits on the richest silver vein in this territory." The world stopped. Silver? Her land? "Tom found it years ago," Blackwood continued, enjoying the shock on her face. "But he was a dreamer, not a businessman. He died before he could file the claim properly, a claim that as his partner I am legally entitled to half of." He turned his cold eyes back to Elias. "But then you swept in, didn't you, Boone? You found out about the silver. You saw a desperate widow about to be foreclosed upon, and you made her an offer she couldn't refuse. You married her to steal her land, to steal my silver." The accusation hung in the air, venomous and deadly. Clara looked at Elias. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. He didn't deny it. He couldn't meet her eyes. The silence was his confession. It was true. All of it. The sudden proposal. The talk of a practical arrangement. His anger when the letter arrived. His fear of Blackwood. It wasn't about loneliness. It wasn't about love. It was about money. $50,000 worth of silver. The foundation of her new life, the love she had dared to believe in, crumbled into dust. "Elias?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Is it true?" He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with an anguish so deep it was almost unendurable. "Clara, it's not what you think." "Did you know?" she pressed, her voice rising. "Did you know about the silver when you married me?" He hesitated, a single fatal moment of silence, and in that silence, her heart shattered. "Yes," he finally choked out. "I knew." The word was a death sentence. Clara felt a cold, empty calm settle over her, the calm of absolute devastation. She looked at the man she had given her heart to, the man she had trusted, and saw a stranger, a thief, a liar. "Get out," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Clara, please, let me explain." "Get off my porch," she said, her voice gaining a dangerous edge. Blackwood watched, his face a mask of triumph. He had won. He had destroyed them without firing a single shot. Elias looked from Clara's devastated face to Blackwood's smug one. A terrible, guttural roar of fury and pain ripped from his throat. He launched himself off the porch, a force of nature unleashed. He slammed into Blackwood, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs, their fists flying. Clara didn't scream. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching her life fall apart, the sound of the fight a distant, meaningless noise. Upstairs, a window opened. Emma and Samuel were watching, their faces pale with terror, and at the end of the hall, the locked door seemed to pulse with a dark, triumphant energy. Whatever secret it held was a part of this. She was sure of it. Her life had not been saved. It had just been sold to a different kind of devil. The fight was brutal and short. Elias was bigger, stronger, his rage giving him the power of a grizzly. He landed a blow that sent Blackwood sprawling in the dust, blood pouring from his lip. "Stay away from my family!" Elias roared, standing over him, his chest heaving. Blackwood wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand and slowly got to his feet. He was beaten, but his eyes glittered with victory. "Your family?" he sneered. "You don't have a family. You have a business arrangement that's about to be dissolved. This isn't over, Boone. I'll see you in court, and I'll take everything. The silver, the ranch, even the children." He climbed onto his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and ruin in his wake. Elias turned back to Clara, his face a mess of cuts and bruises, his eyes pleading. "Clara!" She held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't!" She turned and walked back into the house, her movements stiff and robotic. She walked past the kitchen, past the parlor, up the stairs. She didn't look at the children, who were huddled together in the hallway, their eyes wide with fear. She walked straight to the end of the hall, to the locked door. This was the heart of it all, the source of the lies, the beginning and the end. She had to know. She went to Elias's room. His coat was slung over a chair. She rummaged through the pockets, her hands shaking. She found it on a heavy iron ring with several other old, ornate keys, the key to the locked room. Clutching it in her hand, she walked back to the door. Elias had followed her upstairs. He stood at the other end of the hall, watching her, his face a mask of despair. He didn't try to stop her. It was too late for that. Clara put the key in the lock. It was stiff from disuse, but it turned with a loud, grating click that echoed in the silent house. She pushed the door open. The room was not what she expected. It wasn't a dusty storage room filled with old memories. It was an office, a war room. A massive desk dominated the space. On one wall was a huge, detailed map of the entire valley, dotted with colored pins. On another, shelves were crammed not with books, but with ledgers, boxes of documents, and legal files. This wasn't the room of a grieving man. This was the room of a strategist, a general. She stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of old paper and secrets. Her eyes went to the map. Her old homestead was marked with a red pin, but so were half a dozen other properties in the valley, and a complex web of lines and notations connected them all. On the desk, a leather-bound journal lay open. Clara's hands trembled as she picked it up. It was Elias's handwriting. The last entry was dated the night before. Blackwood is here. Sooner than I expected. He will go to Clara. He will tell her about the silver. He will twist the truth and make me a monster in her eyes. It is the only way he knows how to fight. He thinks this is about the land. He doesn't understand. It was never about the silver. It has always been about her. Clara's breath hitched. She flipped back through the pages. It was a journal of his entire marriage to her, starting from the day he proposed. I saw her today in town. The foreclosure notice will be served soon. Blackwood's agents are already sniffing around. I have to act now. I will make her an offer, a marriage of convenience. She will hate me for it. She will think I am a cold, calculating brute. It is better than the alternative. It is the only way to get her under my roof, the only way to protect her. Protect her? From what? She turned the page. Tom McGraw was a good man, but a fool. He stumbled onto the silver vein and trusted the wrong partner. He trusted Blackwood. He wrote to me a month before he died, terrified. Blackwood was threatening him, trying to steal the claim. Tom was planning to expose him. Then the fever came. Convenient, that fever. I had the doctor's report from back then re-examined. Traces of arsenic. Not enough to kill a healthy man outright, but enough to ensure a simple fever became fatal. Clara dropped the journal. Her knees gave out and she sank to the floor. Tom, her Tom. He hadn't just died, he had been murdered. And Harrison Blackwood was the man who had done it. She scrambled back to the desk, her mind reeling, trying to piece together the horrifying puzzle. She pulled open a drawer. It was filled with files. Each one was labeled with a name. Herbert Hendricks, the banker who foreclosed on her, the sheriff. They were all connected to Blackwood. He had been buying influence, laying a trap for years. In another drawer, she found a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. They were from Elias's father, written on his deathbed. Son, I am leaving you this land. It is a great gift, but also a great burden. There are men like Blackwood who will come for it. They are jackals who will devour everything good in this valley. Protect it. Protect our people. It is the Boone legacy. It is your sacred duty. Elias hadn't married her to steal her land. He had married her to save her life. He knew Blackwood was coming for her, the last loose end in his plan to take control of the silver. He knew Blackwood would not hesitate to eliminate her and the children, just as he had eliminated Tom. The marriage, the house, the protection, it was a fortress. He had surrounded her with safety, all while knowing she would hate him if she ever learned the truth. The locked room was his burden, the secret pain he carried alone. He wasn't a thief. He was a guardian, a silent, lonely soldier fighting a war she never even knew existed. Suddenly, she heard a commotion from downstairs, shouting, the sound of horses. She ran to the window. A dozen men on horseback were in the yard. Harrison Blackwood was at their head. Beside him sat the sheriff, looking pale and nervous. They had come back, and this time they had the law with them. "Elias Boone!" Blackwood's voice boomed. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for fraud and for the assault of a law-abiding citizen. And I have a court order granting me temporary custody of the widow McGraw's children, pending a competency hearing." Clara felt the last bit of air leave her lungs. He was taking her children. She turned from the window, her eyes blazing with a fire that had been forged in grief and loss and a mother's love. Blackwood thought he had won. He thought he was facing a broken woman and a disgraced man. He had no idea he was about to face Clara Boone, and all hell was coming with her. Clara flew down the stairs, her heart a war drum in her chest. She burst onto the porch just as Elias was stepping out to face them, his face grim, his hands empty. He was prepared to surrender to save them from a firefight. "No," Clara said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. She stood beside him, no longer his fragile, deceived wife, but his partner, his equal. Blackwood's smug expression faltered for a second when he saw the look on her face. This was not the broken woman he had left an hour ago. "Ah, Clara, my dear," he said, recovering quickly. "Have you come to your senses? Don't worry. The sheriff and I are here to escort you and your children to safety. The only one who needs saving here is you, Mr. Blackwood," Clara said, her voice as cold as iron. "From the gallows." A murmur went through the crowd of hired guns. The sheriff shifted uneasily in his saddle. "I don't know what nonsense he's been feeding you," Blackwood began. "He's fed me nothing but the truth I was too blind to see," Clara shot back. She held up the leather-bound journal. "A truth you worked very hard to hide. For instance, the truth about your partnership with my late husband, Thomas." Blackwood's face went pale. "You see," Clara continued, her voice rising to be heard by every man in the yard, "I have my husband Tom's last letter, the one he wrote to Elias Boone, telling him how you were threatening him, trying to steal his silver claim." This was a lie. Tom's letter was in the journal, but claiming it was hers gave her power. She saw a flicker of doubt in the sheriff's eyes. "And I have the new medical report," she went on, pressing her advantage. "The one that shows the traces of arsenic in his system. Funny how a simple fever turns deadly when you have a greedy partner, isn't it?" The word arsenic hung in the air like poison gas. The hired guns started looking at each other, then at Blackwood. They were thugs, not accessories to murder. "This is insane," Blackwood sputtered. "She's hysterical! Sheriff, do your duty!" The sheriff looked from Clara's blazing eyes to Blackwood's panicked face. "Harrison," he said slowly, "murder is a serious accusation." Just then, another sound cut through the tension, the tolling of the church bell. But it wasn't the slow, steady ring for Sunday service. It was the fast, frantic alarm that meant the community was in danger. Elias looked at Clara, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He had a plan. He always had a plan. On the horizon, a cloud of dust appeared. Then another, and another. Riders were coming, from every direction. Murphy from the general store, Hendricks from the feedlot. Dozens of ranchers and townspeople, all armed, all riding hard for the Lazy Bee. Elias had arranged a signal with the Reverend. The community was coming. Blackwood saw them coming too, and his face twisted in a snarl of pure rage. His trap was falling apart. "Enough of this!" he screamed, pulling his pistol. "The children! Get the children!" Two of his men dismounted and ran for the porch. Elias moved to intercept them, but he was unarmed. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran back into the house and grabbed the first thing she saw, a heavy, cast-iron skillet from the stove. She ran back out onto the porch just as the men were reaching the door. She swung the skillet with all the force of her fear and fury. The clang of iron on bone echoed across the yard. The first man crumpled to the ground, out cold. The second stared at her in shock, and she swung again, catching him on the shoulder. He howled in pain and scrambled back. The crowd of arriving ranchers surrounded the yard, their rifles raised. Blackwood and his men were trapped. "It's over, Blackwood," Elias said, his voice a low growl of triumph as he stood protectively in front of Clara. Blackwood looked at the sea of hostile faces, at the woman with the skillet, at the man he had underestimated so badly. His empire of lies had collapsed. With a scream of pure hatred, he aimed his pistol, not at Elias, but at Clara. A single shot rang out. But it wasn't from Blackwood's gun. Sheriff Morrison, his face grim, sat with a smoking pistol in his hand. Blackwood stared down at the red stain spreading across his chest, a look of shock on his face. He toppled from his horse and hit the ground, his reign of terror over. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of children crying. Emma and Samuel ran out onto the porch and threw themselves into their mother's arms. Clara held them tight, the iron skillet still clutched in her hand. She looked at Elias over their heads, her eyes full of tears, love, and a fierce, unshakable strength. The community watched in silence as the lonely rancher put his arms around his wife and children, shielding them from the world. The war for the Lazy Bee was over. The real marriage of Clara and Elias Boone was just beginning. 3 months later, the Lazy Bee Ranch was alive with celebration. The entire valley had come for what everyone was calling the real wedding. The sun was shining, music played from the porch, and tables groaned under the weight of food and drink. Harrison Blackwood was a dark memory. The investigation following his death had uncovered the full extent of his crimes. His network of corruption had been dismantled, and the men who had worked for him were either in jail or had fled the territory. The silver claim, it turned out, was legally and rightfully Clara's. Her fortune was made, her children's future secure beyond her wildest dreams. But that fortune was not what she was celebrating today. She stood on the porch, holding Elias's arm, watching their guests. She wore a new dress, the color of a summer sky, and Elias stood tall and proud beside her in a new suit. Reverend Hamilton cleared his throat, calling for quiet. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice warm, "we are not here today to join this man and woman. The law did that months ago, and trials by fire did that in a way no words of mine ever could. We are here today to bear witness to a love that was forged in secrets, tested by evil, and has emerged as strong and true as the prairie itself." Clara looked up at her husband. The haunted, lonely man was gone. In his place was a man filled with a quiet, powerful joy. His storm-gray eyes, when they looked at her, were full of sunshine. "Elias," the Reverend said, "do you promise to continue to love and protect this woman, to honor her strength, and to never again keep a secret in a locked room?" The crowd laughed, and Elias grinned. He turned to Clara, his voice deep and sure. "I do. I promise to spend the rest of my days making sure she knows she is the only treasure I ever wanted." "And Clara," the Reverend said, his eyes twinkling, "do you promise to continue to love this stubborn, secretive man, and to perhaps consider using words before resorting to cast-iron cookware?" More laughter rippled through the yard. Clara's cheeks were pink, but her smile was radiant. "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I promise to love him, trust him, and stand by his side through all the battles to come." Elias leaned down and kissed her, a long, sweet kiss filled with the promise of a peaceful future, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elias and Clara stood on the small hill behind the house, watching the party below. Emma and Samuel were chasing each other through the crowd, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "Are you happy, Clara Boone?" Elias asked, wrapping his arms around her. She leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She thought of the desperate, frightened widow she had been. She thought of the journey that had brought her here. It hadn't been a fairy tale. It had been a battle. But they had won. "I am," she said. "More than I ever thought possible." She turned in his arms to face him. "But I have one condition for our future, Mr. Boone." He raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "No, more. Locked. Doors." He laughed, a rich, happy sound that echoed across their land. "You have my word." He pulled her close. "My whole heart is yours, Clara. There are no locked rooms in it anymore." They sealed the promise with a kiss as the first stars began to appear in the vast frontier sky. The story of Elias and Clara Boone became a legend in Copper Rock, a story of how sometimes the most dangerous bargains lead to the truest love. A story of how a lonely rancher and a desperate widow brought together by secrets and silver, found a home not in a house or on a piece of land, but in each other's hearts. It just goes to show that the greatest treasures are never buried in the ground. They're found in the courage it takes to fight for the family you choose. If you enjoyed this story of love and justice on the frontier, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what secrets the next story will unlock.